I'm John.
And I'm Jessica, and we are the curators of Bad Advice from Church People. You can get bad advice from anywhere. What makes Bad Advice from Church different is that we expect church to be a safe haven of wise counsel. So when advice from church goes poorly, we tend to assume that we must have done something wrong. We must have implemented it wrong. And that makes us feel like we can't claim it as bad advice, which prevents us from asking further questions that lead us to better advice. Our heart for this show is to free people from the shame and stigma of bad advice they have received from people at church. One, by providing a platform for others to anonymously share their stories, and two, by sharing our honest thoughts and questions on these subjects, and in doing so, opening doors for others to have honest conversations that may not result in answers, but empowers all of us to be more authentic with ourselves and others.
Yeah, I think that the vision of it is to ask the questions and to really take y'all on a journey with us. We're asking a lot of these questions. We've been having conversations for years. Some things we feel like we're closer to an answer, some things we're not. But I think that it's beautiful to ask the question and to go on a journey to at least pursue the answer.
Today, we are recording our first episode of Bad Advice from Church People, and today's episode is titled The Over-Spiritualization of Sex.
Yeah, fun topic. I know that for both of us, it's definitely a little out of our normal comfort zone of talking about it publicly. We've definitely had a lot of these conversations individually and then with other people on one-on-one relationships, but definitely a little bit more of a stretch talking about it more publicly.
So this was fun. We felt like, so our heart in doing this podcast is for people to have a place to share bad advice that they've gotten from church anonymously, and not for us to then turn around and be like, oh, this is why this is bad advice, or this is, better advice, and like share our opinions. It's not our heart in it at all, but to share our honest thoughts and questions in response in order to break shame off of the bad advice, or even just the consideration of like, oh yeah, I did hear that at church and I did apply that to my life in this way and it didn't go well. And maybe that's not my fault. And so hopefully our conversations help open a door for your conversations.
Yeah, so our purpose is not to replace the advice with better advice, but more to go on a journey together with y'all and to ask some of the questions that I think y'all are asking as well. And then as we process, maybe it'll bring up some questions that are helpful. Maybe it'll bring up some topics that will bring freedom in your life. So that's kind of the goal. We were going to, today's episode though, we're specifically going to deal with some of the advice that we got about sex and relationships that affected us as well. So we've been married for 9 years now.
Almost 9 years.
Almost 9 years.
And a couple months.
It's pretty close. It's not long. So, so what we encountered was a lot of unexpected issues in our sex life because we thought we were ready to go. We were free. We were we were all in, and we did wait to have sex until we were married, and so it was all brand new from day one, and so it was definitely something that we expected to just go so smoothly.
Yeah. So we're starting off our first episode by sharing our story. Because if we're going to ask people to share their stories, even though it'll be anonymous, it's hard to dig into your past and to share your stories. And we felt like if we're going to ask people to do that we needed to go first. And so in sharing the bad advice that we got, it's not actually advice. It was really the influence of Christian cultures that we are part of, and teaching that we got at church, that really changed our belief systems around sex and around just physical pleasure. And that really influenced us in our first year of marriage. And so in the whole bad advice piece, sometimes bad advice looks like something somebody says on a Sunday morning and preaches from the pulpit. Sometimes that looks like something a mentor at church tells you or just a friend. But it all has an influence on your life because you're looking to church and your church relationships and the culture and the precedent that's set, the teaching that's given to discern how to live your life, how to interpret scripture, how to apply those belief systems to your day to day. So all of that is incorporated in advice.
Well, I mean, that is the purpose of teaching, is for you to start to apply those things in your life. So teaching is a very direct thing. The cultural advice is also a factor. And so one of the names for it is purity culture in one of the issues that we're talking about. But it's a cultural thing. It's not that even someone said a specific word, but it's also that the idea that was communicated to us was impactful because it was cultural. It's what everyone's doing. It's the example that's set. It's the pattern that's set. So I do think that is still a type of advice, even though it's not, here is how to do this in your relationship.
So specifically today, we're talking about the over-spiritualization of sex and how it impacted our marriage, especially within the first year of marriage. And normal episodes will be titled after the piece of advice, and that's given, and we'll share somebody's story at the beginning of the episode and then share our thoughts and questions and perspectives throughout. And so today's episode is a little different. It's also the first episode. But yeah, so when we got married, I had this belief system around sex that sex was, and I don't think I would have like said it out loud. It was definitely heart beliefs more than like mind beliefs. Like, you know what I mean? Like you can know something to be true, know that sex is good, know that sex is like, there's nothing wrong with sex inside of marriage. But then you go from waiting to have sex till marriage, sex outside of marriage being really bad, to then it's everything is permissible, everything is okay. And we waited to kiss till we were engaged. But it took a lot for us to wait to have sex till marriage. Like we just we narrowly missed that.
Yeah.
And so to go from, oh, we really want to do something, but it's not okay for us to do this until we have this party. Then it's, everything's fine and just have at it and it's great. It like overnight, that shift just doesn't happen in your heart and your mind overnight. And so I think we still had good sex. Like it was still enjoyable and we still like got a lot out of it. And I don't remember having like, even on our wedding night, I feel like we didn't like, I heard some like tragic wedding night stories, especially while we were.
Some friends who had very bad experiences.
Yeah, especially while we were engaged. I heard a number of stories, so I was kind of nervous. And we had a lovely wedding night. And I think we still like enjoyed sex. It wasn't what we expected. And the adrenaline rush that we got when we were like making out while we were engaged was not as much there anymore. And so it wasn't what we expected. And then before we got married, I really struggled with masturbation. And so every time that would happen, I would feel this rush of shame and just repent, recommit my life to the Lord. It was this dramatic pattern that I would fall into where I would be really tempted to do that. And then I would give into temptation. And then I would just beat myself over the head of how awful and disgusting are you that you can't control yourself. And I was even thinking about, there was even just a lot of mindsets around the flesh and dying to the flesh and dying to self that was taught as I was a teenager, that, you know, even in terms of like fasting, and you just need to kill your flesh and be more spiritual, and then you will be pure and good before God, and the pure in heart see God, and you're going to have a deeper relationship with God and more intimacy with God, and you're going to know God more if you don't take part in any sort of like physical pleasure, food, sex, alcohol, like even just
Entertainment.
TV and movies, like entertainment, like the more you abstain yourself from the world, then the more holy you are. And yeah, that's a whole conversation. And there's a number of things within that I don't have answers for. And I think we still to this day have a lot of questions around what that means and what that looks like. And even just that kind of dualism of spirit good, physical body bad, physical pleasure bad. So what happened going into marriage out of that struggle as a teenager and that mindset and that belief was within the first few months of our marriage, we would have sex and I would feel those feelings again that I felt when I masturbated, the rush of shame and guilt and feeling like I needed to like repent and recommit my life to the Lord. And I would just be processing all these heavy emotions. And John would be like, are you okay? What's wrong? I'd be like, I'm fine. Because I didn't want to make him feel bad. It's not his fault. And so it just created this barrier where there was this internal struggle that I didn't understand and didn't make sense to me. And we like, he was on a mission to make me orgasm. Like this man is so selfless.
We got there.
We got there. We figured it out. We're very blessed. But I had so much unraveling of beliefs and mindsets around sex, around my body that had to be done in order to just let go and have fun with my husband and enjoy our marriage. And I've had so many friends who we've exchanged stories and they haven't gotten past that. And they're still unraveling beliefs and mindsets. And it's such a tragedy in the lives of so many women that they feel like that have been raised in Christian culture that still to this day feel like sex isn't for them, physical pleasure isn't for them, and it affects their marriages. It has to. And so I'm willing to share my story, even though this is wildly vulnerable and so hard, because I am just so against the shame that's come along with how we've talked about sex culturally within church. And I want to open the door for conversations about those mindsets and those beliefs that have led to that in order for marriages to thrive, for women to actually believe that they can enjoy sex, that it's for them too, and that God is for physical pleasure. It's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. He created the earth and he called it good. There's beautiful things in the earth, even in its fallen state. And so what does that mean? And what does that look like? And I don't have all those answers, but
Yeah, we don't have the answers, but I mean, asking the questions is really the first step towards that. And also, some of it is going to be learning to live with some questions. So when we're talking more specifically about the spiritualization side, I think that for me, I didn't struggle with the same kind of immediate shame response. I was able to enjoy it as a physical pleasure, but I think it also made me feel a little bit like I was missing something and maybe I wasn't leading well or I wasn't doing it quite right because it wasn't this amazing spiritual experience, because we've even heard advice as much as calling it worship and things like that, and that's not really what
sex was
sex
supposed
is.
to be this like super spiritual like
Yeah,
encounter.
it makes you feel
like,
so connected, and there's parts of that are true. So it's not that sex is not spiritual, that there's not elements of that, because we are mind, body, and spirit. So anything that we do, it affects all of those. So if you never exercise, guess what? It actually affects your spiritual life.
Absolutely.
If physically you're
your mental and emotional health.
Yeah, all of them are tied together. So we're not at all making the argument that sex is not spiritual, but what it is asking the question, what does it look like for you for that to be spiritual? I think that's more of the question, because there's times that it has been that it does seem more spiritual or more emotional or both. And there's other times that it's not. It's just something that seems very physically pleasure focused. And so I think that it's more giving space that it could be one day that it looks more spiritual and one day it's more physical.
Yeah. Well, I think you even touched on, like, even talking about exercise, Exercise is completely connected to spiritual, mental, emotional, but it is a predominantly physical activity. And like, I think, reading your Bible or praying, that affects every other area of your life and your mental, emotional health, even your physical health. But it is a predominantly spiritual activity. And so recognizing that, yes, like sex is a spiritual thing. It's connected to our spirits. It can be very spiritual, but it is a predominantly physical activity, and that's good.
And I think that that's a hard thing in the church to process. And I think it's one of the things is I think more than even advice, at times it's the lack of advice and the lack of communication
That's good. Yeah.
on the topic, because sometimes what's unspoken is almost more powerful than what is. So that some of the shame that we felt and that so many people in conservative Christian culture especially feel is the shame that this is not something that we talk about. It's not something. So other things that you enjoy, when I go and I love a basketball game, I can talk about that all I want. That's not frowned upon at all. Or if there's other things that we enjoy, and it doesn't mean that there's not a proper space for that intimacy. It doesn't mean that you share every intimate detail of your life, but it's the fact that even with your closest friends, that's not something that you talk about.
Or even, yeah, like when we were struggling with that in our first few years of marriage, I think we did have a pastor that you talked to some and who gave some very good advice. But there wasn't, I think over time, we felt more and more comfortable opening up conversations with other friends about, hey, we really struggled with this. Did you guys struggle with this too?
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, we didn't know that, like, what was going on. We didn't have words for it. And so we didn't know that we could invite other people into that conversation. And so, yes, absolutely. I think some of it can even be the lack of advice or absence of advice. And I think certainly we've seen that in the lives of a lot when we do open up and have conversations with friends. So often they've gone through the same things, or maybe they haven't. Maybe their story was completely different, but they've gone through other things in their sex lives that they haven't felt the freedom to communicate about with other people. And there's not always a place for that. And yeah, that shouldn't be on a Sunday morning necessarily. It shouldn't be the thing that's preached from the pulpit. It shouldn't be the thing that's, or maybe it can be some. Maybe this is the place to talk about these things. I don't know. But I think they need to be talked about, because I think even seeing so many friends in their marriages that struggle to talk to one another and communicate with one another about their sex lives and trying to figure out that puzzle. And even just the lie that sex is natural and easy and there's not things that you have to figure out. And it is and it isn't.
Yeah, it is and it isn't at the same time. I mean, a lot of it is trusting enough to, and there is a spiritual element to trust and there is an emotional element to trust, but it's something that's not talked about is how you build that trust, how you build that communication. But in the church, one of the things, like I was saying, of not talking about is because we're not communicating about the intimacy of sex. Other than very general terms of it being a very spiritual thing, and you wait for it, and then it builds up to this moment, and where you're let down, and then when you're confused, you don't have anywhere to go because we didn't talk about the practical side of it. So we build up to this spiritual, what is supposed to be a spiritual high, and because that's very rarely reached in relationship, then you feel like you failed, but you don't know who to talk to about it, because it was communicated the big spiritual goal, but then not communicated how to actually get to big moments. And so because there is that shame attached to intimacy overall, it's something that is hidden, and that I mean, it really even has to do with our bodies overall and our perspective of our bodies, that we're supposed to be hidden, and we're supposed to just share that with our spouse. So there's arguments for that. We're not getting into that right now, as much as that when you when you start out a relationship and you're trying to figure out, am I okay with my body? Am I okay with this person's body? And especially if you're in conservative Christian culture and you have not experienced that before, you're already processing so much.
Yeah.
And to then have doors that you feel like you need open to be able to discuss it closed, it makes you feel very isolated.
Yeah. I've talked to multiple other women who literally don't feel comfortable with their husbands seeing them naked. So
Yeah.
like they will like turn the lights out, take their clothes off, get into bed before they have sex because they're so ashamed of their bodies and so insecure that they're not comfortable with their husbands seeing them naked. And I think something that you touched on earlier, that I think is definitely worth exploring in this conversation is that you felt the burden of spiritual leadership.
That's true too.
And so it created everything not going perfectly. Immediately meant that you had to take responsibility and you felt like a failure and took on shame for that.
Yeah, because even if it was good for me, if I'm supposed to be the spiritual leader, if I'm seeing that I don't know what's going on, but there is something that's falling short for her, and obviously, it's gotten a lot better for both of us, but as we've continued to grow, but it's also that, that I had the weight of I need to do it right for me, but also for her.
Yeah. And so I think a lot of men, especially growing up in the kind of conservative Christian culture that we were a part of, they go into marriage feeling like, okay, well, I've got to be the man. I have to take care of everything. I have to make everything perfect and right. And it's a weird kind of perfectionism where when a woman or either one, if you're going through, and it's just that whole dynamic, like we're just not fans, but just that the responsibility is shared and things are going to happen and things are going to go wrong, or there are going to be puzzle pieces that, and what's so beautiful about sex is great sex happens when you can grow in vulnerability and intimacy in that space and be able to identify what you like and what you want and ask for that and be able to share that with one another and be able to just be your most like innocent, playful selves within that space. Like I feel personally, that's my belief.
Yeah.
And I think it's so beautiful because I think it's that it's almost the same progression of I think, not to over spiritualize it, but there is a piece of like it does mirror what our relationship with God looks like and growing in vulnerability and intimacy and healing and having honest conversations.
Well, I mean, really, any deep relationship, it's the same.
Yeah,
any relationship, you have to progress in all of the areas to be healthier.
but I think taking the burden off of men of like, you're not responsible for having it all figured out, and off of women as well. Like you're not responsible for like making him so sexually satisfied that he never looks at porn again. Like let's do away with that.
That's some bad advice that we've heard.
Oh, that lights me up. That makes me mad. Okay, we're good. But getting back to the point.
But yeah, there's a pressure on women as well that's really unhealthy coming into that. And that's definitely has stemmed, if we're keeping with the theme of bad advice, it stemmed from some bad advice of that men are visual, sex is primarily for men. And so women can come into the relationship not knowing how to even ask what they want because this is really the category for the man and it's primarily about him. And so a lot of women really enjoy sex. Most guys enjoy sex, but there's a very small percentage of either men or women that don't enjoy sex. And that's
and both enjoy it more when the other person is having fun. The more it's
when the other person's having fun and you're communicating, because I think one person can be having a lot of fun, and the other person can be out of it. It depends on if you're on the same page and you're communicating.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think that was probably a big gap in how we were taught because it was so taboo that we didn't see any example of how to talk about it.
Yeah.
How to be very open, even between ourselves. because we had never seen that. We didn't know that you were supposed to talk
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we had a pastor that did our premarital like counseling prep, and like he encouraged us to, like, he taught us how to be assertive. He was like,
Yeah.
I want you guys, your homework is to say 3 things that you want to do or that you
Yeah.
like, and to tell each other, because he noticed in how we were talking that we were both so accommodating of the other person that he predicted that was going to be a problem. And even with that, that was still like, we had to grow in learning how to not just say what we want, but like even identify, like, what do we want? And that's there's so much personal growth to be done in that space, for all of us, to be able to identify what we want and to communicate that.
And it's not being selfish, but it's expressing, and that still is a
It's being
core
honest.
core Christian thing of that expressing your own desire is selfish. And that was advice that I got, like, don't express what you want. You're supposed to be thinking of others. And so you're always supposed to be thinking of others. And there's parts of that that are so true and good, but there's also a very real element of, if I don't know how to love myself, and that's a whole thing that can be overdone or done in an unhealthy way. But if I know how to love myself well, I can tell her better how I'm receiving love, and rather than being like, "You're not loving me right. I don't know what you're doing wrong, but but I'm just gonna suck it up because I'm just focused on you."
Yeah, well, and I think that goes back to the whole like dualism concept of like spiritual good, physical bad. And I think that whole idea of just that misunderstanding of humility, even of everything has to be for other people. I can't want anything, especially a physical thing. I can't want a physical thing because physical is bad. And those two things kind of combine together, create the perfect recipe for a lot of miscommunication in marriages and people really struggling to connect in their sex lives.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, any other thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I think that's it. Really, we kind of came in a full circle in a lot of ways, because it all does come down to really how we are viewing ourselves in the relationship and how we're valuing ourselves, and the inability, if you have that false humility and you have that dualism that says that the body and the desire is wrong, then you're starting out at a baseline where, if I'm not trying to pursue my desires, I'm always going to be disappointed.
Yeah. So I think we should end with just an idea, but just the questions that we have walking away from this conversation, because we've shared a lot of our thoughts, but more than that, we want to share our questions. So that way you guys may also be curious and have questions and start some conversations. So I think for me, one of my questions walking away from this is, what does the Bible have to say about the flesh? Like, what does it mean by the flesh? Does that mean our physical bodies? I believe that means our sin nature. So, and I believe in scripture, there are other places that talk very positively about like good physical things, like enjoying good things in life. God created and he said it was good.
Yeah.
And so what does that mean after the fall for things to be good? Are things still good? Did the fall just ruin everything and there's no good left and we can't enjoy our lives? What does it mean that Jesus came to give us joy and joy to the full, to give us abundant life, and for eternity to be now, like for eternal life is to know God and to know the one whom he's sent. And that meaning that, yes, Jesus died to save us and we go to heaven, but we are saved now and we have a life now. So what does that mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. It's definitely a very big picture, broad question.
Big questions.
I think, something else, if you're married, a question is, how do you communicate? What do you like? what do you need in communication? So I would challenge y'all if and even as a single person, I would love for single people to be listening to this episode as well, because what I would challenge you to do is to start to figure out what your desire looks like and how to express your desire in a healthy way. And that still is the question of how do you express desire?
How do you balance that?
While loving the other person. And I still want to always put Jessica first, but also she's wanting to put me first as well. And so I need to help her and to let her love me well, and to to love her well is to also express things that would allow that. So I would say, you know, what does it look like to communicate in a healthy way of that balance of expressing desire, but also being selfless and putting the other person first?
Yeah. And what does it look like as for church culture to, is waiting till sex till marriage still, like, if that is our line, if that's the belief, then how do we communicate about sex that says, yeah, that might be best. That's and really empower people to make their own choices. And instead of, I think, you know, we didn't really get into purity culture, but a lot of the root issues of purity culture is just this trying to control people through fear, and by telling them that they're worthless if they have sex before marriage, and elevating purity. And so what does that look like if you are single, to know that sex is good and beautiful, and it's not for you right now? And like, how do you form your beliefs about that in a way that set you up for success in life? And I think that's so hard, and I don't have answers for all of that. And is masturbation sinful? Is enjoying physical pleasure before you're married, is that a sin? Does it have to do with the thoughts in your head, or does I don't know. I think these are questions that I still have, and
and we don't have all the answers for that. But even outside of sex, I think even just in relationship, starting to find, I think you can practice some of those things without sex, of how to healthily express your desires,
have self-love, self-compassion,
while still being humble and still loving others well. I think that's one of the baseline questions of how to do that. And I don't know that there's an answer across the board. I think individually each person has to see kind of what that looks like for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that whole concept you were talking about of learning how to identify what you want and share that, and that actually being a way of expressing love towards another person. Because in order for me to love you, I need to know what you want.
Yep.
And so one of the most loving things you can do for me is learning to become aware of and identify what it is you really want, and then to be able to communicate that to me, so then I can love you well.
Yeah. Because otherwise that's very frustrating. You're trying to guess at what I might like because I'm too humble to express it.
So if you're single right now, figuring out what you want sexually may not be the most healthy thing for you, but figuring out what you want out of a friendship or out of a relationship, or even just what you want out of your work day to day, and or in your home, and discovering like what your dreams are, what your passions are, what you like and what you don't like, and giving yourself permission to enjoy life and the earth and the good, the things that God called good. And I think across the board we can recognize that all creation, it speaks to the glory of God. It's beautiful. There's in nature, physical, tangible nature, there's the glory of God is present. And so learning to recognize like, wow, I love this, and I think this is beautiful, and I love to be at the beach and be at the ocean, and that makes my spirit come alive. And learning how to identify those things in this season.
Yep.
All right, well, that's it for today. Thank you so much for tuning into our first podcast episode. for
fun.
bad advice from church people. Wildly vulnerable and uncomfortable, but so much fun. And we are so glad that you guys are here.
Yeah, and we are looking forward to all of the questions that you have and some more questions that we have, and just talking about that together and hearing more of the process and going along this journey of asking a lot of hard questions.
Make sure to subscribe and follow along. And we can't wait to hear your stories and to share more episodes and have more conversations.